Hi, and welcome to our mini lectures on the Cold War. This little set of mini lectures looks at the development of the relationship between the Soviet Union and America, particularly in the years 1945 through to 1947, 1948. So we've already discovered how World War II ended and some of the underlying tensions between the relationship between the Soviet Union and the USA, even during World War II. We've taken a look at the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences and how some of those tensions are already starting to play out. And now what we want to do is take a look at some of the events and the triggers which lead to what we could call a full-blown Cold War by the time we get to 1949. So here's our map of the way that we see Europe being divided at the end of World War II. And this map kind of shows us with the reds and the pinks the level of Soviet influence. It's important to understand that the Red Army was taking up a lot of these positions here in the east of Europe by the time of the end of the Cold War, of World War II, sorry. Of course, Yugoslavia is a little bit different, and Albania. They were militarily strong enough to have seized back control themselves from the Nazis. And as we will see, Yugoslavia is very much a communist influenced country, but as we will see, it is not necessarily a Soviet dominated communist country. We did, however, see the Red Army in most of these other countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and certainly into Eastern Germany. So what we've got there is a massive military presence by the Red Army on the ground, which while we're certainly at Yalta, we can see that the Red Army had so the Soviet Union really had a military strategic advantage. We have to remember, however, that once the US dropped the atomic bomb in Japan, and it is clear that they have that weapon of mass destruction, overall, perhaps we might say that the US has a strategic advantage despite the massive on-the-ground presence of the Soviet Union. The atomic bomb really symbolized military, economic, and technological superiority. And it is from this point forward that we can start to think of the US as a superpower. The Soviet Union now started working on developing its own atomic weapon. We don't get there until 1949, and by that time we can see a true equal rivalry between the Soviet Union and America. This term superpower, though, it's not being used at the time in the 1940s. It's a term that we started using more commonly in the 1960s. But it's certainly how you can start thinking for ourselves in terms of understanding the tensions and the competition that is starting to arise between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. Remembering also that we have Germany has been agreed at Yalta and following up in Potsdam, they've agreed to split Germany into 4 zones. So we have the British zone in the north, the American zone in the western south, a small French zone, and also, of course, this red zone here on this map, the Soviet zone in eastern Germany. Berlin here, the capital of Germany, is smack in the middle of the Soviet zone, and we'll come back and see how this little sort of island of capitalism in the Soviet zone is going to become a problem later on. We will come back and look at Germany and Berlin in particular a little bit later on. What we need to do, however, is understand how the relationship between America and the Soviet Union starts to develop after the end of the war. And really, it's a frosty relationship from the very beginning. This is a cartoon from November 1945, and here on the left, this is a representation of the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. Molotov was not a woman, just depicted as a woman in this particular cartoon. You can see the hammer and the sickle all over her lovely dress there. And she's reading a book called A Western Political Thriller. And those men trying to court her, that is, develop a friendship with her, the British and the British and the American ambassadors. And you can see here it's going to be a difficult courtship. A little bit of frost and snow on their hats. They're having trouble getting along. And this is a cartoon from November 1945. They are really, America and Britain is really struggling to develop any kind of friendly relationship with the Soviet Union. To tell the truth, they are just not quite sure how to deal with Stalin. What are his intentions? He clearly has this dominant military position across Eastern Europe. And as 1945, 1946 go on, it's clear that Stalin's not moving. He's not retracting his Red Army at all. And there are many in the US who believe that Stalin was ready to continue to spread communism, to spread even further into Western Europe. Others were willing to wait and play a sort of a wait and see game to see what Stalin was about to do. Anyway, in February 1946, Stalin makes a speech. It's referred to as Stalin's speech, sometimes called the Bolshoi speech because he made it at the Bolshoi Theatre. So February 1946, Stalin makes a speech and basically sets out clearly his belief that communism and capitalism are incompatible. So this ideological difference means that these two countries, America and the Soviet Union, cannot easily join an alliance together. Stalin therefore indicates that he feels threatened, really, by capitalism, and it's absolutely essential for him to have a military build-up around the Soviet Union in order to protect the Soviet Union's borders. Such is the incompatibility between communism and capitalism that they are essentially at war with each other, even if we say the countries themselves are not at war. Now, as you can imagine, the Americans were quite concerned about this speech and the implications of it. So in February 1946, the American government sent off to its embassy in Moscow asking for advice. What's this mean? What's going on in the Soviet Union? What can we expect? And in return, the American government received what is known as the Long Telegram. It's called the Long Telegram because it was a very long telegram. Came back from the embassy, tapped out originally in words. It's an 8,000-word message. And it was written by a man called George Kennan, who had been a diplomat working in Russia since 1933. He was certainly not a fan of the Stalin government, however. And his very long telegram, which came back in February 1946, really started to set out a new direction for the US in terms of its policy towards the Soviet Union. Effectively, what Kennan said is that the Russians are determined to destroy the American way of life and will do everything that they can to oppose America. He warned that the Soviets were driven by a permanent state of insecurity, that they had a very strong communist outlook which was fiercely anti-capitalist and very, very hostile to the West, to the US, and everything that it held dear, the American way of life. Kennan, therefore, is saying that this is the greatest threat the US has ever faced. Now, that's quite strong language when you think that they've just come out of World War II. The Americans have defeated the German Nazis and defeated Japanese militarism. And here is Kennan saying this is actually a greater threat that we need to work, to make sure that it can be beaten. And he's saying the Soviets can be beaten, and we can do it without having to go to war. And the way that we can do that is to basically educate the public about communism, about how bad it is, and make sure that the people are wealthy, happy, and free, and not in need of turning to communism. And here, Kennan is really talking about not just the people within the United States, but what he's really getting at is about Europe and Europeans and where they're going to turn, and that there is a role for America to play in Europe to stop the spread of communism and Stalin's expansionist policies. Kennan also said that Stalin justified his own harsh police state by creating foreign enemies, and he was going to continue his expansionist program and undermine Western Europe and the democratic ideals that the United States was trying to support in Europe. This is strong stuff. We're not going to see the US government react straight away as soon as they receive Kennan's long telegram, but it is a significant event that is going to very much influence the policy we're going to see developing through 1946 and especially into 1947. It's the basis of a new US approach to foreign policy. This isn't where it stops, though. In March 1946, just a month later, Winston Churchill was invited by President Truman to give a speech. And his speech, which is called the Iron Curtain speech, it's also sometimes called the Fulton speech because that's where he gave it in the United States. Now remember, Winston Churchill at this stage is no longer the Prime Minister of Britain, but he is a very highly respected leader who understands what is going on in Europe. And so his words are broadcast not just in America, but they are influential around the world. Churchill's speech, he makes reference to the fact that there is an iron curtain that has dropped down between the East and the West. Now, of course, there is no real iron curtain, but what he's referring to is effectively this border which has grown up between the East and the West. And this cartoon that you can see here suggests that Winston Churchill is asking us to peek behind the Iron Curtain and see what is going on. It's suggesting that there's this massive industrial giant backed by the Soviet Union developing on the eastern side. Here we've got a guard, perhaps even someone like Stalin himself, making sure that nobody comes in. What it was also doing was making sure that nobody got out by that stage. So this concept of the Iron Curtain really starts to highlight the difference that is arising between the East and the West. Churchill's speech notes that we've moved away from the concept of a liberated Europe, which is what they were fighting for, and instead we're seeing a distinct difference between what is happening in the East and the West. Now, Stalin responded to the speech effectively by saying that the Soviet Union has nothing but peaceful intentions, of course, but it does aspire to have loyal states that would protect the Soviet borders. And here's another cartoon, Russia, Stalin effectively saying, we want friendly states all around us, and we are basically willing to build borders in order to keep them friendly towards the Soviet Union. And this is where we can start to use the term buffer zone. So a buffer between what might not be friendly and the Soviet Union. It wants friendly countries around its edges in order to protect essentially the borders of the Soviet Union itself. What we've got to understand, however, is that there were a lot of problems across Europe, and many countries were really torn between what was presented to them as democratic capitalism and communism. There were many problems. You can see here a picture of Warsaw in 1945 and the absolute devastation. The conflict of World War II also created massive numbers of refugees. Europe was not a happy place in 1945, 1946, and people really were deciding between what would actually lead to a good future for them, remembering that some of them had tried democratic capitalism and it had failed them, and led instead to fascism and World War II. So there really was a fight on ideologically between the West and the East, capitalism and communism. In the next part, we'll see how the US now takes a step to really cement that ideological difference.